Hello and welcome to this video for Fortune and Freedom. Every few years, the miracle fuel of the future, hydrogen, goes through a bit of a boom and bust phase. And I'm joined today by the man who's got a lot of experience helping investors make the most out of those booms and busts. The question is, what phase are we in right now in terms of the hydrogen cycle, as you might call it? James, can you take us through what's been happening in hydrogen lately?
Yeah, well, the story really begins, I guess, for investors over the last few years. It really begins in sort of 2020. We had stock valuations really jump in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. Green hydrogen was seen as this silver bullet, really, for decarbonisation. There was lots of hype came in. Stock valuations went through the roof. Lots of countries around the world, private companies, they all announced very, very ambitious targets for green hydrogen. And I guess since then, some investors made lots of money, but since then, we've entered into the realism phase. I would say there's still been, we haven't lots of companies, so lots of projects really, or very few projects have gone past the exploration stage effectively. It's still a very, very early stage. Not many have come into fruition. There's still lots of projects in the pipeline. But the sticking point remains costs. Costs haven't come down as much as expected. The cost for electrolysis, which is the process to convert renewable power into hydrogen, that remains incredibly high. Really, I mean, even the sort of lobby groups in the hydrogen sector, they're now taking a much more sort of muted approach to their targets in terms of costs. So that's where we are now. It remains an industry which is reliant, I guess, on subsidies. Certainly in America, for Biden's IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that has given some very generous subsidies. In fact, just this week, some of those subsidies were firmed up, and we've seen some stock valuations increase because of that. But this remains an industry, despite the hype and despite various cycles that you talked about just then. It still remains in a relatively early stage. At the same time, we have seen other technologies, batteries, heat pumps, and heat sector that they've really taken centre stage. They're really taking some of the, I guess, some of the applications that people, a few years ago thought that hydrogen would be the silver bullet for. We're actually seeing lithium-ion batteries, heat pumps actually becoming, the main players in those sectors. So I think there's been, a bit more of a realism now, rather than being a Swiss Army knife, a one-size-fits-all approach that green hydrogen can take over the energy sector. I think it's now more or less seen as a champagne approach. It'll be certainly very useful, but in more niche applications. So that's how I've summarised the state of play right now.
The promise was so great because, as I understood it anyway, the idea was that as we build out renewables to go to a level well beyond the typical capacity we might need, that excess capacity would go into producing hydrogen effectively for free, because the marginal cost of production of renewables is free. And that this would give us that vast reserve of hydrogen that we would then need in order to convert intermittent forms of energy into something that we can store and use quite broadly. Is that the part that's gone wrong, or is it the issue of how we can actually use the hydrogen, or is it perhaps a different aspect that's come apart?
It's not so much the part that's gone wrong. I mean, that was always sort of, I guess, the challenge. Green hydrogen as a fuel is quite inefficient. You've got at least 70% energy loss from production to end use. In terms of, let's just talk about EVs. We only have a 20% energy loss. So green hydrogen has always sort of struggled really to make, with costs so high, it really needs costs to come down a lot really to start beating some of these other fuels and some other technologies. So that's really the sticking points. There's high expectations that there would be probably a bit more disruption on the electrolysis side of things. Those costs remain stubbornly incredibly high. As I said, at the same time, we've seen decreasing costs in other technologies. Lithium-ion batteries being a case in point. Those costs have really plummeted. At the same time, we've seen green hydrogen costs remain very high. At the same time, green hydrogen was always the natural competitor for a lot of applications for green hydrogen was actually blue hydrogen or other dirtier forms of hydrogen, in terms of using natural gas. Now, natural gas prices those prices have been volatile, but we have seen some price weakness since the big energy spike a couple of years ago. And where we always thought that green hydrogen would undercut blue hydrogen or natural gas, hydrogen from natural gas, actually they haven't. Green hydrogen still remains higher, so it's not even beating dirtier forms of hydrogen. So yeah, I think there's still certainly lots of promise and lots of hope for this sector, but the cost side of things needs to sort itself out. At the moment, we are reliant. The industry is reliant on subsidies, and there's been some very generous subsidies, certainly in the US, where they're looking at $3 per kilogram of subsidy for green hydrogen, and the cost of producing green hydrogen generally is around about $6 per kilogram. A few years ago, some of the hydrogen lobby groups are talking about $1 per kilogram. So we're nowhere near that yet. That's even with incredibly generous subsidies. So yeah, that's where we are now. So I think the key point really is for green hydrogen is the cost of electrolysis, and really to get that lower so that some of those inherent energy inefficiencies that we see with green hydrogen can be mitigated to some extent.
The part that I still don't quite understand is, what is this cost of electrolysis? Because as it was sold, the idea was that the excess energy produced by renewables would go towards this electrolysis. And so, the marginal cost of electrolysis should be close to zero. We have negative electricity prices sometimes in markets because renewables are producing so much more than we need. So where has the cost gotten out of hand here?
Just the stage of electrolysis. So these big, gigawatt scale electrolysis projects are really, really incredibly expensive. So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is you talked about, building out all this surplus renewable power. Now, because of this inefficiency, you actually need to overbuild solar and wind really to make it worth your while. So that hasn't quite happened. Obviously, there's lots and lots of other use cases for solar and wind. And we're sort of struggling in some ways to meet up demand for those. So, to build an even greater excess of solar and wind just to feed into these very expensive electrolysis machines, that's the sticking point. There's at the same time, costs are falling down elsewhere. Projects are falling by the wayside because of these reasons, really. And we're seeing other technologies take market share of projects or sectors that, a few years ago, we thought that green hydrogen would be making real sort of giant headway in. It's not to say, that it's all doom and gloom. I think we might well get there. But I think, as I said, it was going to be much more for niche applications than this sort of silver bullet, one size fits all, Swiss Army knife approach that everyone talked about a few years ago. The story for the last few years really has been on electric batteries. I think how sort of economical they are these days, and whereas in 2020, 2021, people were talking about green hydrogen having a good market share in transportation, particularly sort of the heavier duty trucks and so forth side of things. Actually, we're seeing cost and range of electric batteries improve so much. Actually, it looks like lithium-ion batteries are going to take that market, leaving no room at all for green hydrogen. So really, it's been attacked from all sides, really. I think, as I say, remains an industry overly reliant on subsidies right now. It's been interesting to see what happens in the US now that these subsidy rules have been firmed up, and whether we've seen some companies like Bloom Energy and so forth rise in response to that. Whether they can sustain those valuations, we will see.
It's an interesting conundrum, because one of the promises of hydrogen was that it would stabilize electricity markets by providing this sort of residual demand, right, that we could always use energy for, and therefore energy intermittency in terms of supply wouldn't be as much of an issue, and negative prices wouldn't happen as much because we'd always just have this possibility of producing hydrogen. So without that, things get interesting. How much of a hole has the struggle of producing hydrogen in an economic way left for things like net zero targets, things like the industries that need to decarbonize and electrify and so on and so forth? There's been a big story here in Australia about what the struggles of the Fortescue Mining Group and its green energy and hydrogen sector might mean for the government's targets. But what's your more general analysis of that situation?
Yeah, it's been a blow. We can't lie, certainly for countries like Australia, which were so keen and heavily pushing sort of green hydrogen. But as I say, other projects, we might have seen some green hydrogen projects not fall by the wayside, but actually money and investment now is going back in towards batteries, heat pumps, and all sorts of other things. So it's not doom and gloom. It's not at the end of any goal for net zero, but I think there's just been a bit more of a realistic approach now to green hydrogen's role in net zero. It's going to probably be smaller and a bit nicher than we once thought. But the costs of solar and wind, they are certainly solar, and now with the onset of bigger batteries, this really is going to be the next phase of the clean tech story and help countries potentially, hopefully, reach their net zero target. So the batteries now is now, I guess, the big story rather than green hydrogen. So that's going to incentivize a new wave of investment in solar and wind, and certainly helping industry and the power sector as well, other forms of industry to decarbonize. But green hydrogen it is certainly going to have a role to play. But I think we're looking at things in fertilizer industries, farming, with ammonia, and sort of other sort of industrial, sort of more niche industrial applications. But I guess the headline sectors, the power sector, the transportation sector, I can't really see green hydrogen having a major role that maybe a few years ago we thought it might do.
Yeah, let's talk a bit more about that demand, because that's quite interesting then. So that's that heavy industry, the sorts of parts that need fossil fuels at the moment and use large amounts of energy. That's an obvious application. What happened to this story of feeding hydrogen into the existing gas pipelines? Are there any other demand stories that are emerging, that are new, that have created a bit more optimism for the sector?
Yeah, the heating side of things, that has had a terrible one. That's had a tough old run, really. There was lots of hope that hydrogen could revolutionise the heating sectors, particularly in Europe, where we're reliant so much on natural gas. There's been lots of studies. Can we blend hydrogen in with the natural gas in the pipe? Because the pipe network actually is very complementary to allow hydrogen to flow through it. But so there's lots to talk about. Blending hydrogen in there. There was a big study and a project up in the north of England. Cost has been really high. It's really gone nowhere. Every sort of study done by independent auditors, independent researchers shows that it's not feasible. It's too expensive. It's just not going to happen. And all those projections from the heating sector have really quietened down now. You don't really hear anything or very little about green hydrogen being the silver bullet for the heating sector. At the same time, we're seeing heat pumps. Heat pump technology has improved a lot over the last few years. Costs have come down as well. Certainly in the UK, with certain retailers, you can get a very relatively reasonably priced a heat pump these days compared to where we were just 2 years ago. So I think it's now obvious that heat pumps will be the heating technology of choice to electrify heating rather than using green hydrogen. In terms of there are other technological advancements. We've seen recent milestones in sort of solar to hydrogen directly, producing green hydrogen directly from solar panels without electrolysis. That could be, that could certainly lower costs, enhance energy efficiency. We'll see that it's not an industry that stands still. the key point to attack is the electrolysis side of things. So if we see technologies that sort of bypass that, I think we could, green hydrogen might, recapture some investor sentiments of similar ilk that we had a few years ago. But for now, I think certainly, what I would say to subscribers of my services is more of a sort of wait and see approach. Let's take a look. I think investors made lots of money a few years ago. A lot of that hype has come out of the sector. It's not going to be the one big great panacea, but there could be some very interesting uses for it where investors can look and and make some money out of, certainly in niche applications. But got to keep your eye on all the other competing technologies.
Yeah, if it's a question of cost, then at least there's the potential there. How much of a hydrogen market is there at this point? Is there supply and demand like we might think of in terms of oil and gas and all these very developed sources of energy? Or are we talking about really sort of isolated projects and deals between, a once-off production source of hydrogen and a once-off demand source like a public transport network or a particular industrial process? Or is there a real liquid market?
I would say it's a liquid market now. We're still at a really, really early stage still. I think I read somewhere that only 1% of the thousands of projects that have been announced over the last 2 years have gone beyond the initial sort of fact-finding stage. Very few are actually now functioning as green hydrogen projects, but you are still seeing projects, still seeing new announcements for projects. I mean, India just this week announced a $21 billion plans for a green hydrogen hub in India. It wants to produce lots of, I think, 1,500 tons of green hydrogen daily. So, we are still seeing big headline news, but it's certainly much more muted than it was a few years ago. I mean, the EU has, I wouldn't say it's scaled back its plans, but I think there's been a recognition that costs haven't come down as much as they want. It's going to be struggling to reach some of these quite ambitious targets it set itself. But yeah, we are still seeing some announcements, but it's not I wouldn't say it's the green hydrogen market. Is that prices are still quite opaque as well. It's not the most liquid market. All eyes really have been on the battery side of things for that headline news in recent in the last year or so, rather than green hydrogen. But that's not to say with a big technological advance. And let's also talk about gold hydrogen, natural hydrogen. That's just hydrogen produced naturally rather than having to go through the electrolysis. That we're now having a much greater understanding that green hydrogen is produced naturally. That could be. There's lots of risk here. There's lots of challenges to extract it, to store it, of course, to transport it. But that could be the next stage of the green hydrogen story. That's hydrogen produced, extracted naturally from rock formations. So there's lots of now investment going into first of all understanding where these pools of hydrogen are stored. And how to get to them, and we'll see if anyone is successful in actually pulling it out of the ground and commercializing it. But that could be the next stage because from all intents and purposes, apparently there's huge pools of naturally producing hydrogen across the globe, and that could be the next big story.
Is there any prospect at all, even if it's just long term, about hydrogen becoming cost competitive with fossil fuels, or is all of this purely a net zero carbon emission story?
There is. I mean, if you asked this a few years ago, all the talks was on we could get to $1 to $2 per kilogram for green hydrogen, which would certainly you're getting the stage where you are getting parity towards fossil fuels. Now that hasn't proven the case. We're still, as I said, somewhere upwards of $6 per kilogram. So I would be quite cautious to say that we are, the green hydrogen sector is going to compete with fossil fuels without some huge or big improvements in either electrolysis, without some technology that bypasses electrolysis, including natural hydrogen. I think Without that, I think we have to be realistic. It's an industry that will remain for the short to medium term, potentially longer term, on subsidies to get to make the business use case economic. Because as things stand, to be realistic, green hydrogen is nowhere near that right now.
Well, hydrogen's been one of the big talking points in the Fortune and Freedom mail inbox for a very long time now. I hope this update from James Allen has helped everyone figure out where things stand. I know James will be following this story for many years to come. So will I. I'm looking forward to the next hydrogen hype cycle. Hopefully it'll be based on technology and not subsidies or net zero, if you ask me. But the point is that the opportunities remain. James, thanks very much for joining us, and to everyone at home, thanks for watching.